Okay, hello and welcome to our second podcast version of our UA debate series of the 2020-2021 academic year. Thank you so much for joining us. We had a great discussion last time about podcasts themselves, and I'm happy to talk to you about the announcements of who was the winner of our last debate. First, I want to just let you know what we're going to be doing tonight. Tonight, our second podcast is going to be about cancel culture, and the resolution that our four excellently qualified debaters are going to be discussing is cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. We'll be arguing both the affirmative and the negative on that particular resolution. Before we get into that, we have an absolutely fantastic guest speaker with us tonight. We're honored to have Dr. Roberta Seatley, who's going to be talking to us about the concept of protest itself. A few announcements before we get into our conversation. I'm proud to announce that Jesse Gates was the winner of our last podcast. And as is the case with that one, we'll also be announcing the winner of this podcast at our next event in 2 weeks, which will be on voting rights. At that event, we'll be arguing the resolution of our voting election system is fair, not rigged. So we'll be looking forward to that. And again, we'll be announcing tonight's winner at that. The way that we are going to be choosing tonight's winner is through our voting system on our Facebook Live page, also on our Instagram. And if you are watching this on YouTube, you can look at our description underneath the video. We decide our winners here at UA Debates not by who gets the most votes, but by who changes the audience's mind the most. So if you could check your answer before you hear any of the debaters to this resolution, and then check your answer also afterwards to let us know how much your mind was changed. That will greatly help us determine who our winner is. Again, if you could start checking your answers now for the resolution, cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. You can do that by looking in the comment section of our Facebook or in our Instagram account. That said, I'd really like to get started by talking to our fantastic guest speaker tonight. Again, we are talking tonight to Dr. Roberta Seatley. Dr. Roberta Seatley is an associate professor in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. He is the author of Justice, A Question of Race. It focuses on his 7.5-year quest for justice in the courtroom, involving 2 trials stemming from a case of police brutality that almost cost him his life. Obviously, we are more than honored to have our special guest with us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Seatley, for being with us this evening.
Yes, good evening.
So, like I said, because we're going to be talking about protest and cancel culture and how those two intersect, and obviously you're an expert on the idea of protest itself, I'd like to just throw a sort of very general question at you to start, which is, what do you see as generally speaking, the aim of protest? What does protest as a form of speech tend to try to achieve as its goal?
That's a great opening question, because I think if we just only spoke about cancel culture, it could go in different directions. But I think, when you're talking about protest, it's a challenge to power. And I think that's the key, at least for me. Because obviously I've heard, that the concept of cancel culture is not new. It just has a new terminology. I'm sure some of you, I'm looking at ages, maybe some of you have heard of the concept of PC, politically correct. That it's pretty much the same thing, and that was what, maybe 80s, 90s type of phenomena. So in other words, and so people have known about these ideas about when people go a little too far, or at least the claim is that it goes too far. But you have to remember that what people are doing is they're seeing something wrong, like segregation or discrimination, etc. And then somebody decides, like, wait a minute, we're not going to accept that. It's not right. And so they protest in different ways. Now, we're living it right at the moment as we speak, both with the whole coronavirus pandemic and also the police brutality pandemic. That is, the simultaneous protests are happening as we speak. Not that I need to plug my book, but I actually wrote a new book. That book you mentioned was from about 20 years ago. The new book is called Yolki, A Warrior Summoned from the Spirit World. And what I do there is I do an analysis of all the police brutalities as far back as I can go. And for me, I literally go back to 1492. And I was almost killed, so that's why I have the interest. But people don't have to agree. But I mean, at least that's how far I took it back. 1492 on this count.
It's exactly, I think, because of your life story and the fact that you have personal experience with exactly, the far end of sort of shutting down protest, right? The sort of extremist ends of that. That I'd be interested in knowing. You used the words "too far" before. I'd be interested in knowing. Do you have any opinion as to whether or not there are forms of protest that go too far, or that are sort of ill-focused, or that maybe sort of miss the mark?
Absolutely. And I think that goes for any political perspective, from extreme right to extreme left and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
That if people become dogmatic, people become intransigent. If they don't listen, of course it's going to happen. It's just there are some people that just have that characteristic within them where they're right and everybody else is wrong. And sometimes they become part of political groups that think that way, so they attack everybody else that doesn't think like them.
So to that point, I actually, so a question I often sort of pose to my students whenever we're discussing things like protest, just as a sort of thought experiment. Let's say that we have a controversial speaker come to speak on campus, and a group of students come to protest that speaker and say, we're not in favor of this person representing our school or being a public speaker on our campus. Would you say that is an example of a group of students trying to curb somebody's right to free speech because they're not allowing them to make that speech? Or would you say that it's them expressing their First Amendment right to protest?
Well, I think the context is this, because in the ideal form or situation, everyone should have the right to speak, et cetera, et cetera. But what if you have, like, say, the people that killed that young woman in, what was that, Charlottesville?
Mm-hmm.
That come in there and say and cheer that on. I think most people will be troubled by that. Kind of like, wait a minute, you just killed a young woman who had nothing to do with anything other than protest and injustice. She gets killed, and now we're rewarding the speaker, paying him $20,000 to promote that.
Sure.
I think people would be bothered by it. But see, here's what I think. Because I've been a journalist my entire life. Since I was 18 years old. I'm 66 right now. Meaning, that's my life. The freedom of speech, freedom of expression, etc.
Sure.
So I couldn't defend the idea of censorship. But I think the context is this: what if you have 10 speakers, in a year, and 9 of them do not represent, say, that minority point of view, so to speak, or in whatever realm we're talking about, whether it's political, political or racial, or, at whatever level. So say you have 9-1 as an example, maybe people are protesting the fact that it isn't 5-5, that is, if you have 5 speakers that speak about a topic and then you have 5 people that speak against it, then I think people will probably be okay with that. But a lot of times what happens is that, and I've seen that many times, where, people get the super big bucks, are like, well, wait a minute, why is that person speaking and why are they getting so much money? Especially when they're trying to destroy us.
And I think what's interesting about what you're saying, Celia, is I think that what you're talking about are the attempts, sort of social corrections for sort of past injustices rather than legal ones. In other words, you're not talking about regulating it so that you must have 5-5. It's sort of more about, as you said, sort of whatever the majority seems to think. If people mostly agree that this is what's right, then that's what we can do, which I think is a good transition sort of with the last direction of our conversation tonight into cancel culture itself. So can you talk a little bit about how it is that you think that cancel culture and protest intersect, or if you think that they do?
Well, I mean, again, personally, I think it's in the eye of the beholder. Of course I've heard it, but I think the person that put it on the map in the biggest way was Ivanka Trump. She started complaining about cancel culture, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute. It's like now it's almost like a weapon. It's been weaponized. So if somebody's doing something wrong and somebody says, I object to that, You can't ban Muslims from coming into the country, and then all of a sudden, oh, this is cancel culture, you know. So I'm thinking, that's why I'm saying it's in the eye of the beholder. And it's just like I think during the Reagan era, they used to call it like that your revolutionaries are no, what did they call them? Our freedom fighters versus, I think they call them. I don't know if it was communists, but
Yeah, versus anarchists.
yeah, anarchists or terrorists, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that. It depends on what you know. Again, that eye of the beholder. Uh, and again, it's nothing new. It's been here forever, and I think part of it is who controls the discussion, so to speak. Who controls the language?
I think that's no. I think that's entirely true, and it's funny you say that. I was watching a debate just yesterday from 1991 about the idea that free speech on American campuses is being threatened, and that's almost 30 years ago, and we're still having that exact same argument now. And even though it was threatened, apparently it's somehow been able to last. But I think that's a really great point about it being in the eye of the beholder. I think that's what we're going to be talking a lot about in our debate this evening is sort of, which are the anecdotal individualized cases versus which are the ones that are sort of indicative of a problem. But I appreciate that. The last thing that I'll ask before I let you go, Dr. Seeley, is there any time that you hear the language of protest being used for a cause that you think maybe doesn't sort of deserve the weight of that kind of language? In other words, sort of overemphasizing or maybe enlarging what people think their cause is. And I'm thinking of celebrities celebrities sometimes using the wrong word or exactly the kind of sort of political incorrectness that you're talking about, and the language of protest being used against those situations rather than sort of larger social injustices like the one that you had experience with. Do you ever feel as though there are some instances where the language of protest is maybe inappropriate and that it's maybe far overblown?
Well, remember what I began with the idea of power, you know, and I think if we take that into context, power. Most of the celebrities don't have real power. I mean, they have, you know, they call what they call them nowadays, influencers. Yeah. So if somebody makes a mistake, you know, personally, I mean, I could care less. You know, and again, I'm talking about a mistake, right? One, twice, maybe.
Sure.
But if you have somebody that's a known, say, a known bigot, for example, you know, and preaches Nazi philosophy, that's not a mistake, you know, and I think that's a difference. So if you have a celebrity that's a known Nazi, so to speak, that's different. But most of the celebrities, they don't need, you know, 90% of them probably, you know, it's almost like the cause of the day, you know, that they'll go from one cause to another. So, you know, they're saving dogs this week, you know, and if they say something wrong, I mean, again, who's going to get upset or too upset about that, right? But I think it's about power. Those in power, now, if they are the ones that are creating laws that literally discriminate against, you name the group, you know, I mean, that's different. And so, yeah, so that the example of celebrities or well-known people, it's different. Mistakes are different. And you know, we have examples of many examples of people with power that do those things. And I just wanted to add something real quick.
Yeah, please.
In relationship to power, and it's about voice. You know, in other words, voice and power. And so in this society, we have silencing and invisibilization, and I think that's also has to be thrown into the mix, because if you have somebody saying, "Hey, you know that." You know, I got canceled out because they were protesting and on and on. I go, maybe the people that are trying to protest, maybe they don't, maybe their voice is being silenced, you know, and they don't even have a mic, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Or worse, they get invisibilized, or both, you know. Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever. I work with families that have lost family members, you know, to law enforcement violence. You know, a lot of them feel. I mean, I think that topic probably gets in there into the conversation about
Sure.
who can speak and who can't, who gets silenced, who gets invisibilized. And like I said, to me, it's such a huge topic that again, the topic of the eye of the beholder is very key to this. But again, always in relationship to power.
I think that's it's a great point. It's a great note to end on and to transition, because I think that what we'll be talking again a lot about is exactly the question of sort of who gets silenced, what is silencing, what are those individual instances, and where do we see in the eye of the beholder. So thank you very much, Dr. C. I really appreciate you joining us, and I think it's a great start, and it's going to really inform our debate this evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's hop into our debate itself. And let's talk about tonight's resolution, which again is this: cancel culture is an inefficient form of protest. Please, if you have not yet, vote on this resolution. Cancel culture is an inefficient form of protest. Vote either in favor or against this resolution, again, in the comments section below on Facebook, or in our description on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube. Tonight we're going to be looking at the affirmative, which is Molly and Kat, and the negative, which is Emily and Pavas. And we're going to, as we always do, we're going to go in 3 rounds. First, we'll be having opening statements from the affirmative and the negative. The affirmative, as usual, will go first. We'll have a second round where our debaters will have a chance to address each other, ask some questions, and answer my questions. And finally, we'll have very brief closing statements from each team. And after that, you can go ahead and vote for who it is that you thought did the best job. And again, we'll be announcing the winner of tonight's debate at our next debate in 2 weeks, which will be on voting rights. Okay, so opening up the debate on the side of the affirmative of this resolution, cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. We have Molly Krantz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that warm welcome, Ted. Good evening. Some of you may know the popular comedic YouTube star Shane Dawson. He makes a series of videos usually spoofing or making fun of another person or topic. He recently took it too far when he made several videos sexualizing young children. After this, I thought, well, yeah, let's take away Shane Dawson's platform for sexualizing and exploiting young children. That way he will get what he deserves. But I had to ask myself, is that really an effective form of protest? Does that create any change in my community? If I cancel Shane Dawson, will he learn anything from making these grotesque videos? Will canceling even damage Dawson in the long term? The answer is no. Today, Dawson is making just as much money, if not more, and has actually gained subscribers on YouTube since being canceled. That's the flaw in cancel culture. It is all publicity. I'll say that again. It is all publicity. There is a reason people like Kevin Hart, Dave Chappelle, Ellen DeGeneres, Jimmy Fallon, Shane Dawson, and many more high-profile people are still very relevant today, because canceling isn't a permanent or effective solution for protesting. There is no message in cancel culture. There is no opportunity for growth. There is no opportunity to learn how to be a better person. And most importantly, there is no political change in cancel culture. We see political change is focused on a peaceful transition of ascending ideas to a higher level. These ideas should promote a learning process, not a cancellation process. Peacefully learn why an idea is wrong and advance that as a general consensus for our society. Cancel culture does exactly what it sounds like. Cancels an idea and doesn't challenge the fundamental thinking of why an idea is wrong. Examples of effective forms of protesting are the Women's March on Washington in 2017, the release of President Donald Trump's tapes commenting in vulgar language describing in detail how he can sexually force himself onto women due to his wealth, economic status, caused almost 500,000 people to show up with vehicles, planes, bikes, anything they could possibly think of to participate in this movement and rise against his ignorant and sexist behavior. Another peaceful protest that made huge advancements for our world is the tree sitters of the Peoria forest. In 1978, logging companies were attempting to destroy the rainforest in New Zealand. Conservation activists built platforms to be used as tree houses, and they stayed there to prevent the trees from being cut down. You may ask yourself, was this effective in the long term? And the answer is yes. The government permanently stopped all logging operations, and the area was turned into a park. We see when protests have a dialogue, an open dialogue, it encourages peace and learning opportunities that can blossom into permanent solutions. Cancel culture is the action of taking away the opportunity to advance someone's education about an idea. When prompted about the effectiveness of cancel culture, former President Barack Obama had this to say, quote, "That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get very far. That's easy to do," end quote. For these reasons stated, I urge you to vote affirmative on the motion, cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. Normally, if we were all in a live forum, then we'd hear thunderous applause right now. So thank you very much, Molly. And opening up the debate on the negative side of the resolution, again, that is cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. We have Pavas Gupta.
Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Ted. Thank you also to Molly for her arguments. Okay, let's get into it. Cancel culture does not have the best reputation. More often than not, it is associated with negative connotations. In fact, my own partner this evening, Emily, was skeptical about defending our position before we dove into our research. A lot of this has to do with a mischaracterization that Molly and Kat will attempt to convince you of tonight. Honestly, if my current understanding of cancel culture was based on popular conception, or even limited to viewing it as a way of punishing minor errors in judgment, I would be skeptical too. So I understand where some of you are coming from. What Molly and Kat are trying to sell you is a reductive notion of cancel culture. Therefore, I would like to provide some clarity. Cancel culture is not a malicious weapon that people use to ruin the lives of public figures. Rather, its objective is to initiate conversation and dialogue on multiple levels. By doing so, it aids marginalized groups that almost always have their voices stifled. Cancel culture provides a medium, a platform for such groups to self-advocate, which is the strongest form of advocacy since it allows for affected communities to talk about their own issues. This is facilitated through accessible public platforms such as social media. Further, canceling is simply just the calling for and practice of withdrawing support for a public figure after they have said or done something considered objectionable or offensive. This is how real change is created, through dialogue and scales of accountability. Real positive change is not instant. It is a slow, gradual process that is often multiplied through ripples that are created by media such as cancel culture. Molly and Kat will try to convince you that cancel culture ruins lives, or that it is a threat to free speech and is therefore an ineffective form of protest. But Emily and I believe that one cannot deem an entire protest medium ineffective simply because it challenges the status quo. By doing this, it brings into the folds of conversation issues with ideologies that had dominated society for a long time. Moreover, it is important to acknowledge that just like other forms of protest, cancel culture has its own problems, but its benefits outweigh its flaws. As already mentioned, cancel culture is not a weapon. It simply starts a dialogue, whether it's about racism, discrimination, or sexual misconduct. These are things that need to be talked about. Additionally, it does not strip anyone of their ability to speak freely. Objects of cancel culture often retain their platform and level of influence. Take J.K. Rowling, for example. Recently, she's been under fire for anti-LGBTQ+ comments. However, she still has a huge following, is active on social media, and is selling books in huge numbers. In this case, canceling J.K. Rowling did result in erasure of her public image. It just began a much-needed conversation about objectionable behavior. Sometimes objects of cancel culture are people who have done things we can all agree are unacceptable, such as Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein is a predatory man who, though he faced legal consequences for his sexual misconduct, also experienced a freezing out by his industry after pushed by cancel culture. I think we can all agree that something good came out of cancel culture as it facilitated the serial predator being held accountable socially and legally. It also limited his access to people he could hurt. Furthermore, when industries are prompted to act in solidarity with survivors and marginalized groups, change is initiated. To end, here is our argument. We, the negative, argue that cancel culture is no different than any other medium of protest and should not be written off as ineffective simply because it challenges the status quo. Cancel culture begins conversations on accessible public fora by groups that would otherwise have had little influence or no voice, and has effected real positive change when legal action was neither an option or was ineffective. We hope that through our arguments this night, you will choose our side to vote for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavas. Okay, so after our first round, just to recap, Molly's argument and the app's argument in general suggesting that cancel culture is sometimes it is our gut instinct when we see something that we don't like, but generally it's ineffective and doesn't actually end up ultimately leading to anything substantive. They make this argument largely because their definition of protest or the goals of protest tend to be to change people's minds or to change substantive things that happen at the top levels of power, and they simply don't think that that happens. In fact, the argument they make is that cancel culture tends to silence people rather than further conversation. The negs argument from Pavas is largely arguing the direct opposite. They're suggesting that ultimately the goal of cancel culture is not to cancel anyone because people can't actually be canceled, and they suggest that it's actually an opportunity to open up a conversation from those who are powerless to those in power. And exactly because we were talking about the concept of power in our conversation before the debate began, I think that's where I want to start. So let me pose this question back over to the AF. Molly, some of the people that you were mentioning in terms of those who had sort of faced, for lack of a better word, the wrath of cancel culture, they are famous people, they are celebrities, they are people who have voices and power. So can you talk about do they not in some ways, as the neg is arguing, do they not in some ways deserve to sort of hear the voices of their fans who are sort of just private citizens?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for bringing that up, because they do not only deserve but should hear from these comments that, they are making, especially Pavas mentioned, minor errors in judgment. There are specific instances where, as our speaker was saying earlier, you say one wrong word and it all leads down a treacherous downfall. But what the AF is really highlighting and what Kat and I really want to highlight is that the whole point of these, big instances, I did list some big people like Ellen DeGeneres and Kevin Hart, is that the big problem with cancel culture is that there's nothing coming out of it. They are facilitating these very important conversations, but then after maybe a month tops, it just completely drops, as opposed to the Me Too movement, which Pavas brought up, which I'm so glad she did, because the Me Too movement is a much bigger movement than something, let's say, that Kevin Hart said that led him to not host the Oscars. The Me Too movement was a bigger message. It facilitated, interviews and women to come out in their bravery and really bring a light to, especially the damage and the exploitation that is happening in Hollywood. And so that's kind of the difference that we're seeing, is that the Me Too movement is just like that. It's a movement. It's not necessarily as much cancel culture, because there is a huge message, there is a movement, as opposed to, just bringing up Kevin Hart instance again with his comments being made, is that it was dropped in purely of a month. There was no message, there was no movement. You're
looking at cancel culture sort of individualized instances, a series of sort of isolated instances, and as opposed to sort of a movement. Can I hear from the neg? I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, is Molly correct in saying that there's nothing coming out of these things, that people have sort of short attention spans and are moving on too quickly?
Pavas, would you like to answer that, or is it cool with me, or if I answer it?
You can go ahead.
Thank you. I think certainly there are going to be instances where it's not perfect. Protesting is messy. It's not, targets aren't always exact, and, but that's true for every protest medium. Cancel culture is no different. And I think it is incorrect to say that nothing good comes out of it. I mean, I think it's a good thing that after Kevin Spacey's sexual misconduct came out, that, he was fired from House of Cards. He had his platform minimized. I think that's good that he then had less access to people to hurt. And I think it's good that, Netflix showed their solidarity with survivors, that we don't want to hire, predators. I think good things have definitely come from cancel culture. Pavas, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, even though the outrage that Molly talks about may seem short-lived, you're starting conversations that really matter. And some of these multiply in amplitude on social media, and they reach so many people, which is more accessible than what traditional forms of protest are. So I wouldn't want us to write off cancel culture as a form of protest simply because you think it's short-lived, but the conversations that are created are actually long-term and they get people to think about the issues.
Kat, let me turn it to you. So it sounds like your opponents are sort of responding to the suggestion from the AF that the series of isolated incidents, they don't really have long-lasting effects. Emily brings up instances like Kevin Spacey. Pavas before brought up Harvey Weinstein, who did face real world consequences. Do those count? And if not, why not?
I'm glad that you asked that, because those weren't really instances of cancel culture. It was more instances of victims coming out about their experiences and being very brave and sharing their experiences with the public and actually calling for action to happen, rather than, posting on Instagram going, Kevin Spacey's bad. It was more, here's what happened to me after I met Kevin Spacey. Here's all of the list of things, of horrible things that he did. And I thought it was interesting that Emily brought up how Netflix chose to stand with survivors and didn't hire those people, but Netflix is still kind of allowing it in. They still have Chris D'Elia's, who is also a known child predator and groomer. His comedy specials are still very popular on Netflix, and no action came from that. And so these actions in particular with Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey and these child predators and sexual abusers is not necessarily cancel culture, because these are victims coming out and saying, here's what happened to me, we need to do something about it, rather than this person is bad and let's just make them delete their Instagram. It's more so, we should be taking legal action, and we should be taking much deeper action into looking into the histories of these people and looking into what they're actually doing, and these survivors coming out about that, which is a very, very brave thing to do, because that is very difficult.
So I'm going to let the negative respond, and then let me ask my second question.
Emily, can I go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what we're arguing essentially is that when you think about it, no form of protest is completely isolated, right? When you talk about the Me Too movement, the hashtag was a big thing, and that existed on social media and amplified voices. Just with cancel culture and the cases that Kat talks about, cancel culture is essentially supplementing, right, the survivors' accounts of abuse. So cancel culture, like any other form of protest, isn't isolated. And when you have a movement, or when you have objections to questionable behavior, there's so many ways in which it happens, and cancel culture just amplifies voices in many cases, and that's what we are talking about.
Could I add to that?
Yeah, sure. And then I'm going to go ask my next question.
Okay. But kind of building off of what my partner Pava said, you talk about the Me Too movement and cancel culture as if they are, isolated different forms of protest, but really they're very intertwined. I mean, like Pava said, so much of the Me Too movement was online. It was about, bringing to light maybe the actions of this person or that person. So they're not really that different. Because I mean, cancel culture is all about, social change. You talk about the importance of political change, but social change is just as important. And I think that's important. I mean, the Me Too movement, that's a social issue, as well as a political one when, there's legal action, but it's too intertwined to be pitting them against each other.
So I want to pose my next question, and let me throw it to Molly here. I know that we've been talking so far a lot about people like Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, people who sort of, I think that we would all sort of objectively say deserve some sort of consequences for their actions. And I think that the debate so far has been whether or not those consequences have been effective or ineffective, and whether they come from cancel culture. So let me ask the next question over to the F. Rather than talking about people who we can all agree sort of deserve these consequences, Molly, can you talk about any instances where you think that somebody faced the sort of wrath of cancel culture who maybe wasn't deserving, who was successfully canceled in your eye, who didn't deserve to necessarily go away from public life?
Yeah, that's an amazing point. And I think that is the problem in general with cancel culture, is that there really aren't too many cases, other than the very particular cases of, the Me Too movement, Kevin Spacey, where they are completely canceled. Taking Ellen DeGeneres for an example, her stocks and her value plummeted for a very short period of time. And it really did look like Ellen DeGeneres was going to completely cancel her show. It looked like she, as you said, was successfully canceled. And when the publicity lowers from it, then she has a platform to then rise and come back from canceling. And that's the reason why we are disagreeing that cancel culture aligns with the Me Too movement, because the Me Too movement has a bigger message. It has people who are coming out and very bravely speaking about their experiences on Harvey Weinstein, and there was legal action taken, as opposed to cancel culture, which in Pappas' own definition is aligned with social media and aligned with responses. So like how Kat was saying, where someone posts something and they say, you're bad, you're making comments, reporting them, just leaving social media damage as opposed to damage as a whole.
So Molly, is your suggestion then with Ellen that she did deserve to be canceled, or that she didn't deserve to be canceled? What's the argument there?
Of course, I think that Ellen DeGeneres deserves to be canceled. If you make a poor decision and if you make actions that aren't worthy, you do deserve to be the action of canceled, having your platform taken away from you. But what we're prosing is, how effective is that? Bettering our community. What Ellen DeGeneres is still sitting in her $13 million mansion in the hills. How is that benefiting our society is what we're asking.
I have a question for the affirmative, if that's okay. So I remember, Molly, you said it erases social media damage as opposed to actual damage. Is that right, or did I get that wrong?
I'm sorry, what did you say? My computer was cussing out. Social media damage as opposed to what?
As opposed to actual damage. I think that's what the last sentence before you answered Ted's follow-up was.
Thank you for reiterating that. When I say actual damage, what I mean is long-term damage. What I mean is damage that is sticking and damage that is actually would damage somebody's career and cause them not to work again, like Harvey Weinstein, like Kevin Spacey.
Okay. I think when we talk about social media damage versus actual damage, I think we need to take the people against whom these objectionable comments or remarks are being made. For example, Rowling's transphobic remarks obviously hurt people who identify as transgender, right? So when cancel culture comes out and says, that's wrong, J.K. Rowling, they're essentially, they're kind of validating the victim's feelings, right? Validating their identities. So that, I personally think that is effective, right? Like, identity issues, validation, people from marginalized communities really need that. You think that's not important, even that little bit of validation versus invalidation?
No, I think that validation itself is very important. And I think that just like how you're taking a more neutral stance, how it can be beneficial in some instances, we totally agree with you. The affirmative agrees with you that it really helps promote and start those very important conversations. But we're just asking ourselves how effective that is in the long term, considering that these people who sometimes have created very heinous things uploaded on the internet, that they are still making as much money, creating that as much content as they usually are, and we're just asking how beneficial is that in the long run? What change are we creating from that?
I'd also like to add something if I can. In regards to J.K. Rowling, she was not the one affirming people's identities. It was other fans that, because if anyone of the audience is unaware, J.K. Rowling has produced a lot of transphobic tweets, among other pieces of transphobic and anti-LGBTQIA content, and many fans have come out against that. But that affirmation, we do think that people's identities should be affirmed, but that's not coming from J.K. Rowling, and nothing has happened from her being canceled. She hasn't lost any money. She still has fans. She's still making book deals and putting out Harry Potter merch, and nothing has happened. No long-standing change has happened other than people go, okay, J.K. Rowling's transphobic now. That's just a statement of fact. Nothing has come from that. And that's kind of why we're saying that cancel culture is ineffective as a form of protest, because nothing has come from this action of canceling someone.
And I also, can I piggyback off of that, Ted?
Let's hear from the Neg for a minute, because I think we've heard a lot from now. Hold on.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I don't think that Pavas was saying that J.K. Rowling's comments affirmed anyone. She was saying that the act of collective voices, voicing their displeasure over J.K. Rowling's comment, like that will give people like who've had maybe negative experiences of a certain kind, or, it will give them that validation and sense of like community. I think whether or not we think J.K. Rowling's tweets were this or that, like it's still, the point is people came together and their collective voice gave them a sense of validation. And that is important for marginalized people to feel seen and heard, especially by other people in their community. That's important.
So let me pass the ball over to you, Molly, because I know that you had something to say, but it sounds like, and Emily and Pavas, tell me if I'm getting it wrong, it sounds like what you're suggesting here is that cancel culture is larger than the celebrity or the public figure, the media figure, whoever it is, it attempts to cancel. That you're suggesting that the point is to sort of to change the conversation to whatever the surrounding, in this case, the offense of transphobic tweets. It sounds like you're suggesting that that's your answer to the affirmative charge of what are the long-lasting effects. So, Molly, if you could respond to that, do those sound like real, tangible, long-lasting effects in terms of what you were asking before?
These conversations that we are starting, that for instance is like the J.K. Rowling, how it is starting a very important conversation about, transgender rights, that's amazing. But that is the first step. And that is where cancel culture lacks. If you look at, my peaceful protest example with the March on Washington, there was change that came out of that. They marched on Washington and there was so much media and there was so much information that was brought to light about Trump's true acts of, I don't have an educated word for it other than just repulsiveness. And with that march, people were able to educate themselves further. And I think that now is showing that in this next election, we are seeing that there is a substantial amount of women who are voting against Trump because of these sexual harasses. Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I was gonna pose my next question off of that. It's a great point, Molly, and I'm gonna pose my next question to the Neg because my last two have been for the F. So, Pavas and Emily, it sounds like what Molly's doing here is she's sort of she's suggesting that cancel culture is ineffective, and particularly ineffective in comparison with other forms of protest. And since, Pavas, in your opening, you sort of defined cancel culture as a medium, right? As sort of, it's not necessarily about the content we're talking about, how it is that the content's getting out there. So can you guys talk about that? I mean, do you feel as though there are more successful forms of protest? I heard Emily earlier say that all kinds of protests can sometimes be messy and sometimes unfocused. So can you talk about other forms of protest and whether you think that they're more or less or as successful?
This is cool if I start.
Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start out by saying that, social media is a relatively new thing. That medium for communication and now, protesting, it's still something we're figuring out, as a society. So of course, like protest methods that have been around before social media and have had more time to kind of develop and get more sophisticated, of course, those might be more effective, but that doesn't detract from cancel culture's effectiveness. Just given, you said there haven't been tangible results like long term, but I just think that's untrue. You look at people push for cancellation of somebody that can prompt legal action, or like they're a minimizing of their platform, or even this summer, like people were canceling historical figures and taking down their statues. Like that is real, tangible. Like you look and those statues are not there anymore. In Philadelphia, there was a statue of a well-known racist politician. I can't remember, I think he might have been mayor. But enough people were like, we cancel him, and they took down that statue, and a lot of people were happy about it. And kids aren't going to have to see that on their walk to school anymore and be reminded of this racist, unpleasant figure. Like that's a tangible result, I think.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
So with your
it's a debate. You're more than welcome to respond. That's the whole point.
Af and Ned get a specific amount of comments. So I just want to make sure.
you guys are a model of decorum compared to the debates that we've seen so far from our leaders. So yeah, go ahead, Mom.
So Emily, I kind of just wanted to ask a question to you. So as far as you mentioned this statue that was brought up in Philadelphia, I also can't remember the name, but I remember that statue being taken down. I don't remember seeing that, posted on social media, and I don't remember seeing my peers going, let's take that down. Cancel culture is stemmed through social media. We are gaming together as social media and going, let's cancel somebody, as opposed to, as far as I know, it was educated organizations that were saying, let's take this crap down. It's disgusting. We are raising ourselves to a higher standard. Let's take it down. So I think that I was just making sure that I had clarification, because it seems like there was just like confusion between social media and like actual platforms.
Right. I mean, I'm from Philly, so I saw it on my social medias when the protests were going on. I mean, it could be just where you're from. Like, I feel like because that's such a niche thing, like, if you're not from there, you might not have been seeing it on your social media, but I certainly did. So
well, and as Dr. Zetley said, I think a lot of it depends on the discourse community for whom these things matter, right? And so it's going to change. Like as we said before, eye of the beholder. What's important to different groups. Kat, let me hear from you very quickly. So again, I think what I'm hearing from the NEG, and I'd love to hear you guys answer or sort of discuss a little bit. I know Molly before was suggesting that something like the March on Washington, a rally, right, was incredibly effective. It's something that we could agree was important. There's also rallies like the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. So can we talk about that? I mean, is it not true that it sounds like what your opponents are saying is that there are sort of different forms of protest, that sometimes they can go right, sometimes they can go wrong? What distinguishes cancel culture as something that is particularly ineffective, just as they said, a medium rather than the content of it?
So the basis of cancel culture, and we've all agreed on this definition of it, is essentially the act of withdrawing support and withdrawing a platform from a prominent social figure. And so, like Emily said, social media is new. This is also kind of a new form of thing, of if you would like to call it protest, you can, but it's a new action of canceling people. And what is kind of distinguished is the same thing we've been saying. There is protest in its essence creates long-standing change or long-standing reactions and actions and things. And cancel culture just doesn't do that. When you withdraw the platform of someone, we so barely see it stick. Like Molly's been saying with Kevin Hart and Ellen DeGeneres, many YouTubers have lost their platform, but not really. They're still on YouTube. They're still having fans, making posts and everything. And those other forms of protest, you can protest through social media. Social media and cancel culture are not one and the same. Cancel culture has to happen mostly through social media. However, other protests that are actually effective and actually doing things can also happen through social media. And it's kind of that divide that we're trying to differentiate between, because cancel culture is not the effective one. There are lots of ways to have an effective protest through social media, and it's actually, in particular, a really nice way in this kind of day and age where you may not want to gather outside in the streets and go to the Capitol or go to your city hall, whatever. You can have a really effective protest over social media, but canceling people is not it.
So the medium cat that you're suggesting is social media rather than cancel culture.
Yes, social media or in person, there are more effective ways to hold a protest over lots of different forms and mediums, but cancel culture is not the one that's going to be effective, because it just doesn't stick pretty much at all.
Well, I gave the... Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to piggyback off of that because, Pavas, you mentioned in your speech, that we as the AF, we're going to try to convince the audience that it does destroy lives. And that's the whole point of what we're saying, is that it doesn't destroy lives. If Kevin Hart completely had his platform taken away from him, we wouldn't be here right now arguing this. And I think that is the problem with cancel culture, is that it doesn't stick. It can in most all the words. It can, and it sometimes does facilitate very important conversations, but it doesn't do as much for lasting blossoming of legal action.
So I give the first word to the AF. I'm going to give the last word over to the NEG. You guys can, either one of you or both of you are allowed to respond to what your opponents just said, and then we'll move on to our closing statements.
Pavas, did you want to speak or can I answer that?
Okay, I think I'll go ahead if that's all right with you. Okay, so I think the affirmative is limiting their definition to the cancellation of that one particular public figure. What we're saying, it goes beyond that figure. The conversation is part of a bigger picture. It's not essentially about erasing that person off social media. That's not what our primary objective is. It's about conversation, sparking and igniting conversation. And if you think about it, conversation is the way that bigger movements take birth, right? So with the March in Washington, how do you think people got to know about it? Because there's conversation surrounding it. That's how they mobilized themselves, and that's how they did, and that's how they came together. And as the affirmative says themselves, that was a movement that created actual change. That starts with conversations, and all we're saying is that cancel culture provides a platform for these conversations to take place. And social media, especially in this day and age, is an accessible platform.
And Emily, if you want to add on to that, and then we can move on to our closing statements.
Sorry. I was going to say, I think Pavas pretty much covered it, but the only thing I would remark on is, Molly, you said that, it doesn't prompt long-lasting change. But here's the thing, cancel culture has only been around a couple years, and, oftentimes to see real social change, it takes like decades. I mean, the civil rights movement started, in the 60s, like the most recent one, I guess, in the 60s. And, we're still knee deep in like a lot of issues like with race in this country. So I think it's kind of naive to expect social change and political change that quickly. After only a couple of years, it takes time to see the effects.
Okay, anything else you guys want to respond to each other? You can respond in your closing statements. That was a really, really great back and forth, guys. I really appreciate the respect that you had for each other and the substance of your arguments. I will say it's really weird. I don't know with these things, I don't know where to look because I have like my camera up here. I have like my lens for my laptop right here. I want to look at myself so badly, but then I keep on looking at all of you while you're talking. So like I have no idea where I'm aiming at. Okay. Let's go ahead and move to our closing statements. And again, we will begin with the AF. So closing out the affirmative side of the argument that cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest is Kat Lewis.
Thank you. Cancel culture by its nature is an oh my god. Sorry. Thank you. Cancel culture by its nature is an ineffective form of protest, not only because it is dependent on the public keeping close tabs on every single celebrity or public figure at all times, but also due to the fact that it simply cannot permeate the number of outlets that these celebrities and organizations have to promote themselves and share their content. When someone is canceled, it can really only reach a portion of the population that is interested in that someone and that has social media. And then whose responsibility after it is it to keep that cancellation going after that immediate outcry? Cancel culture has no lasting effect, as I've stated multiple times, and has no kind of impact on any kind of issue other than sparking conversation and then leading into different forms of protest. Cancel culture in and of itself is not an effective form of protest as it stands. The intention of protests at their core is to create lasting change, and cancel culture is not a form that permits such long-standing change, thereby making it an ineffective form of protest. We believe that protests in other forms are better suited to create the change we need to see in the world, and that takes time. We know that. This is not to say that we should protest against any prominent figure that makes any minute mistake, or even an intentionally offensive comment or action. We shouldn't stage a whole protest against them, depending. By immediately calling for someone to be canceled, we give them no opportunity for growth. We often even reinforce their poor behavior by calling attention to them, rather than trying to correct that behavior and correct what they did wrong, whether they did it intentionally or merely out of ignorance. I'd like to remind you of what my partner told you about cancel culture at the very beginning. It's all publicity. Cancel culture stifles productive conversation and debate and reinforces opinions held in ignorance rather than betterment and positive change. Celebrities and prominent figures such as J.K. Rowling, Ellen DeGeneres, Chris D'Elia, Kevin Hart, Dave Chappelle, they've all previously been canceled at one point or another, and what has that done? Literally nothing. Some of these figures you may have been pretty unfamiliar with prior to the controversy surrounding them and their subsequent cancellation, but now they're more notorious and well known than ever. Clearly, the idea and action of someone being canceled is born out of a day and age where people crave instant gratification while saying they want change. The only way for us to see true, tangible, and long-standing change is to engage in actual formulated education and protest rather than a 2-second post on a social media outlet calling for the removal of a figure's platform. For these reasons, we strongly urge you to vote affirmative on the resolution cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. And before we get into our final resolution, or our final closing speech, we usually hold this information hostage before everyone votes, but you're going to be able to vote anyway. So just very quickly, our last announcements while Emily gets her notes ready. I want to let everyone know that we have a really great fall season coming up for the rest of our resolutions. In 2 weeks, on October 22nd, we're going to be discussing voting rights with the resolution, our elections are fair, not rigged. On November 5th, we're going to be discussing gun control, and we're going to be discussing the resolution of gun rights are essential to a free society. And on November 12th, we're honored to have guest speaker Stanley Fish, one of our preeminent American legal scholars, have an hour-long conversation with us. So please make sure that you join in as we move through the rest of our semester. And we're going to hear the final speech from the NEG right now, and then you are all free to vote. So presenting the final speech for her side and for the entire debate on the negative side of the resolution that cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest, we have Emily Chrysanthus.
Thank you, Ted. Well, hi, everybody. I'd like to start off by thanking you all for tuning in this evening for this debate. I think it's been pretty interesting. So tonight, we've heard a lot of good arguments, both for and against the resolution that cancel culture is an ineffective form of protest. I acknowledge and understand much of where my opponents are coming from, and I can see the validity of some of their concerns. However, it is easy to dismiss a concept that challenges the status quo and then deem it negative, especially when viewing it through such a narrow lens. Therefore, I'd like to take a minute to look at this issue with more honesty. The current power disparities and lack of justice in our world are no secret. Even in our quote-unquote modern times, many people do not have a voice and have to fight to be heard. Cancel culture, in essence, gives marginalized groups a voice and a degree of influence to affect some real positive change that they might not have otherwise. Contrary to what my opponents might want you to believe, proponents of cancel culture are not overwhelmingly bitter individuals, angrily typing death threats on Twitter, nothing like that. They're often people who've experienced racism, discrimination, or sexual abuse, or they're individuals who stand in solidarity with these groups and do not want to see perpetrators and predators in positions of power go unchecked. Next, I'd like to discuss some points made by my opponents. So at one point, Molly said that the Me Too movement has a bigger message than cancel culture. But that's the great thing about cancel culture is that though it is flawed, Pavas and I don't deny that, it works pretty well in that it opens the door for so many different kinds of discussions about so many different social issues, whether it is, sexual misconduct or racism or workplace discrimination, or, literally any social issue you can think of, it can be talked about in cancel culture, has been talked about in cancel culture. Another point was that Kat mentioned that it doesn't allow for growth. And Pavas and I do not condone when people are ruthlessly attacked online, or we don't even really consider that to be true cancel culture. That's just, harassment. But at the same time, it's not like these people's platforms are taken away. And I think it is a learning experience being called out and having the opportunity to gracefully respond to maybe something you did that wasn't it. I think that is a learning opportunity for everybody, for that person to learn how to apologize, for other people to learn how to react to those sorts of situations if they're ever in it themselves. So I don't think that cancel culture eliminates the possibility for growth. And then finally, Kat mentioned who's responsible for keeping somebody canceled, but as Pavis and I have reiterated many times, like, cancel culture is not about keeping somebody canceled. It's about, you notice something that a public figure said or did that is clearly just not it, or and talking about it. You talk about why it's not it, and you just get that conversation going. Movements are bigger than one person, there's been so many historical figures who have started movements and they're dead, but their ideas, are still here. They're still taught in schools. They're still talked about in cancel culture. It's really about the ideas and the conversations that are long lasting. So yeah, in conclusion, cancel culture is not a threatening movement. It's just a protest medium like any other that can be utilized by the common man, by people, to affect real positive change or to at least start a dialogue. So who are we really to call that ineffective, an entire medium? So with that, have a good night and vote negative.
Thank you very much, Emily. Okay, and so that concludes our debate. Please vote again below in the comments section, or if you're watching this on YouTube, you can find in our description the vote. We'd love to hear how it is that your minds were changed. And again, we'll announce the winners of tonight's debate at our next debate, which will again be on October 22nd about voting rights. Thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to Dr. Seeley for coming, giving us a really enlightening conversation before our debate began, and for sticking around. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all of our debaters. This was an incredibly respectful debate. It was fascinating to listen to. No flies landed on anyone's heads, which was, a great change. And Honey really loved everything. She was sitting here watching the entire time. So thank you all, and I appreciate it. And everyone who's watching, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.